So hello and welcome everyone. We are just seeing people file in. Now, as you're just joining us, I would love for you to type in your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. So Victor, we're just going to do a little bit of soft introductions for everyone because we have people from all over the world joining us. So if all of you would be kind enough to hit the chat, see that your keyboard is still working, just type up your name and where you're joining us from. Hello, Jonathan. Good to have you with us. So we have Denmark, Czech Republic, Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, Norway, of course. We have Denmark again, Costa Rica, always my favorite or one of my favorite countries. Denmark. So far, Victor, I think Denmark is leading like 3-0 versus Brazil here. This is a good match.
Belgium is coming in. I see Germany, of course, Portugal. It's going to be close. Twice Belgium. Hi, Bart. Nice to see you again.
And we have one of my good friends from school from Spain, so he's obviously making up for a much better Spanish team. But this is going to be great. So welcome everyone. My name is Chris. I am super happy to welcome you to this webinar on cluster business models. And for those of you that have followed this work for a while, you know that my partner in crime, that's Victor, has really kickstarted a big piece of work. And Victor, I don't even know if you remember. Do you remember when we first started talking about cluster business models, like way back?
I think it must be January last year, so January 2020, when we were. Does anyone remember that pre-COVID, and we could travel and visit each other and do stuff together? But anyway, we met in Stavanger, and we did a really brilliant master training week with a lot of people all over the globe. And when we started discussing clusters, I think I was the only one involved in clusters, so I had to do a lot of explaining to the other guys in the room, and that I think was the first real trigger on, okay, how do outsiders perceive clusters and why is it so difficult to get them going and work with it, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that was really one of the first times that we started thinking about this stuff.
I agree, and it's been a fun journey since. Now, Victor, before we kick off, there's a gentle reminder that you need to speak up, turn up, or lean into the microphone. Your sound is a little bit off.
Okay, I'll speak up a little bit. Yeah.
All right, perfect. So, welcome everyone. As always, there will be plenty of time for questions and hopefully some decent answers. You're more than welcome to put any questions into the chat, into the Q&A. And then also save them towards the end. We'll have time for some good Q&A towards the end today. Now, the agenda that we have is Victor's going to talk a little bit about the background and the big picture. Then we are very happy to share with you 2 case studies. These were some of the co-authors and contributors to the report. And then I'm going to share some concluding remarks on the cluster business models and some of the key insights that we have gained. We're going to have time for Q&A, summary, and then end the webinar, and you can all jump to your next Zoom call. Now, the speakers we have with us today is Victor Haase, who is now the International Ecosystem Director from Health Valley in the Netherlands. We have Andrew Gobelin, who is the project manager and really a business model expert from the construction cluster of Slovenia. And Andrew, I know you have a presentation ready, but I think it's really cool to bring your previous background and experience with business models and now connecting it into the world of clusters. That's a sorely needed combination. So I'm glad to have you with us, Andrew. And we also have Vladimir, who is the CEO of the construction cluster of Slovenia. And then from Australia, and Andrew, I just got to tell you, I think it's really, really cool to have, a Kiwi, if it's what it's called, or an Australian maybe, or a robotics cluster expert with us. Because, the saying on the street is that Australia doesn't have a good cluster landscape. but I think you are proving them wrong. I mean, what you're doing and what your larger cluster initiative is proving is that we can actually build very, very healthy clusters without necessarily having a strong previous background. I think that's maybe extra inspirational for our friends in Ireland who's joining us. So Andrew, always really high expectations to your input. And then finally myself. Now I want to share this before we unleash Victor. So I know you guys haven't seen this, but I picked this up today, finally came off of the print. And it's really funny because we were kind of expecting to create a short 40-page report. And what we ended up with was a pretty hefty, much larger than expected. And also thanks to Jolene, who does the design, a much nicer piece of work. So some of you have this coming your way pretty shortly. But I got to tell you, whether you're online or in paper, this is a really, really cool. And I'm very happy to thank Victor for kicking this off. So Victor, let's talk about cluster business models.
Yeah, let's do so. Let me share my screen here for a moment. Oh, you are still sharing, Chris. Can I?
Absolutely.
This one. Okay. Hold on. Okay, let's kick it off. First, of course, you say thank you to me, but I really must also thank you, Chris. And I really want to say it one time in front of the whole audience. I really respect the way that we kicked this project into high gear, and we had some bumps along the way, but I think in the end, especially the video this morning of the unboxing and getting it into a physical copy, I'm really happy with the end result. So thank you for pushing, and thank you for keeping this conversation going. But why talk about business cluster models? Because it's really difficult. For one, when I started my innovation manager position in Health Valley about 6 years ago, I really had no clue of what this cluster world was, how to look at regional economic development, how to deal with all these different stakeholders, how to run these different projects. I had experience on all these parts from different jobs, but to put it all together in one responsible area, that was something new. And trying to make sense of this cluster world and all the different stakeholders led me to make this doodle. I just started drawing the world around me, and it helped me explain a lot of the work on these birthday parties. I know all these cluster managers out there, they recognize when somebody asks you, what are you doing? Cluster manager? Yeah, okay. And the people move on. But it helps build these areas and these images. And what we've done in Health Valley, basically a couple of months ago, we really started using the tool set and really started working on the strategy for our own cluster coming for the next couple of years. We have a new board coming up. There's a new line of programming coming up. So we really had to look for our own strategy. And this one, the cluster business model canvas, I think it's a very familiar one for most of the people out there. They can relate really easy to the cluster business model or to the business model of Osterwalder in the original format. And we've changed it a little bit to pinpoint more the areas of important to a cluster, basically the financing and the cost structure of clusters. And not only working this visual model, but also being able to build in this business strategy in the business cluster field. That's really important. I think you need to do a lot of explanation to also other colleagues on how to work on this business modeling in the cluster field. So this really helps. And while we were working on the project and on the booklet that we now have, one of the major key insights for me was this model of the cluster value triangle. because I think this model more or less has everything in it in one piece. You have you can see the ambition, the business model, and the structure and the governance. And if you relate to this model and you can start working with your colleagues on this model, and you can get the rationale behind the model across to your colleagues, I really feel that you're on a good way of building out the business model for your cluster. And it has to do with the fact that talking about ambition and the strategy, that's maybe one of the first key elements that you can start working on with your team. And I think you recognize the supercluster strategy intro map on the top. It's really a simple model, but in simplicity, it's really powerful, because if you get the team together and formulate that business ambition, the main ambition of your cluster, and work out on the key areas, later on you can go to the cost structure and the financing with your financial department, etc., and you can work on the governance model and the structure. But it all ties in together in this cluster value triangle. Basically, these 6 canvases behind it are I think maybe even the starting point of any good cluster business model to start working on. And looking at these input, the different canvases that you use, these are only the starting points. This is just one of the areas that you can start working on, and this needs to be repeated. It's an iterative process. And that also reminds me that now in this COVID area where we've done so many of these online workshops, I think one of the key insights also is, I don't know how you have experienced it in running different groups, but be aware that not everybody is on the same level of this online trick boxes like Miro, etc., etc. So have some time and have some patience sometimes with other people working on the Miro board. Just recently, we had a workshop with one of the CEOs from one of the partner companies, and it was really the first time that they were on a Miro board. So be sure to have a successful working commitment or workshop. Pay some attention to the online digital skills. Even if we're already a year online, it sometimes may vary how this works. Because basically this is what we're all longing to get back to, get people in the room and start building on the strategy of clusters. And again, one of the adagiums that Chris is always saying, bring all the pieces, and here you see all the pieces that you need in getting the cluster business model going. You can work with the simulation that we're running, the supercluster simulation, but also bring in the canvases and be able to go into a simulation and go to a canvas and work on those canvases. Until that time, it's, I think, digital all around. But I think the tool set that we made, both online and now also offline, will set you on a good starting position to start working on these cluster business models. So I hope that works out for you. Any questions, just keep them coming in the chat, and thank you for your attention. Chris, back to you.
Thank you, Victor. Now, I do encourage everyone to ask really difficult, like really, really sharp and advanced and complicated questions for Victor. I know he can take it. Andrew, my friend, we're going to jump to our first case study from Australia. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. Do you want to run your own slides, or should I do it from my end?
Oh, if you've integrated them already, we can go with yours. It's fine. Right. I can just go next slide, and that just keeps it easier.
Show is all yours, my friend. I'm looking forward to hearing your story.
Okay, next slide. Oh, okay. It looks like you haven't. Oh yeah, you have. Well done. Well done. Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Victor, for allowing me to and share our story in this process. It was a fantastic experience. Just weighing for introduction, if we go to the next slide. So I've taken some of the pieces out of the, and to just help frame who we are. So in terms of the type of, we're an emerging cluster. So that's something to really be in mind. But one of the things we've sort of come from is a trust-based sort of collaboration piece. So we've got the networks happening really nicely. But these other areas we're still very much working on, especially the public-private partnership. Our government down here, as Christian was alluding to, is not necessarily as supportive of clusters as other countries around the world, but we're working on that, and we're slowly wearing them down and bringing them to the party. We are solving problems. We believe that we are going to be an economic engine for the country. And we already have examples of magnets that are bringing people into Australia and into our clusters. Unfortunately, and I apologise for bringing this up, but from a COVID perspective, we are actually doing quite well. And so that is actually, we're seeing some of the effects of that, and we are seeing some people coming to Australia to do business and to actually relocate as a result. So that's positive for us, not so positive for others, but it's a good situation. The other piece that I wanted to highlight is that we're building an industry. So there isn't an existing industry. Robotics is not listed in the Australian Bureau of Statistics. There's not a lot of, I guess, data that's collected. We officially are not an industry. So we're trying to build ourselves as a dedicated industry. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to really give you a quick snapshot. This is our ecosystem. So it's a fairly healthy mix of companies, entrepreneurs, mixture of different age of companies. We've got a very rich academic research base. And I just wanted to highlight that we actually graduate a significant number of mechatronics engineers, which is essentially the core of robotics, but it's not the only one. There's many others that constitute the industry. But you can see from the rest of the map that it is a healthy map. So that's in our favor. Next slide, please. So also to just put into perspective, and this is important from a business model perspective and how we've evolved, we're actually part of a larger ecosystem, as Christian highlighted. So we've got a Robotics Australia group, which is actually a national body to help us with our narrative. And we do have an issue that we need to address with our national narrative around robotics. We also have a sister cluster in Western Australia that we're supporting and building up. So I'm really interested to hear about the lessons of the super clusters, because I really do believe that our end goal is to have a robotics super cluster for Australia, and we're contributing to that. Next slide, please. So I just want to quickly highlight the opportunity, and this is why we've evolved the business model that we have, and also the imperative for speed of which we're trying to do things. Next slide, please. So we're in a robotics boom, and this was highlighted by the Silicon Valley Bank a year or so, actually early last year. This is the first time that the Silicon Valley Bank has actually done a report on robotics, so it's pretty significant in the robotics community. But you can see that there's steady growth. I would say that they would probably need to update this slide due to COVID, because I think these are conservative numbers. Next slide, please. So just to also highlight, like last year was the height of COVID, and we're still dealing with the effects of it, but there was still a healthy amount of investment that was going on. Here in Australia, we do not have a lot of investment into hardware companies, and so it was actually pretty significant to see one of our cluster members, Swarm Farm Robotics, raised $4.5 million, as well as Precision, a sort of instrument player, also raised 4 million. That was mostly domestic sourcing, but in comparison, you look around the world, Neuro, which is actually provides robotic solutions for logistics chains, and so that investment was definitely spurred by the growth in online shopping, and also the necessity to get food and other things to people. We go to the next slide, please. The thing to highlight is that last year, Neuro got 940 million, This year, it was another 500 million. So the investment is still coming. So this is really just to highlight the robotics boom that we're in. Next slide, please. So the problem, I alluded to this issue before earlier. Our key problem here is the narrative. We have a government, a national government, that is scared of using the word robot because they feel that robot equals no jobs. So what we're trying to educate and try and leverage lessons from many countries around the world who have demonstrated where you do bring in automation, when you do bring efficiencies into the workplace, you actually can generate significant growth, and that growth actually means more jobs. But it also, the other piece is actually growing our robotics industry. We're actually creating those products and services, and we're actually creating growth. So that's the key piece that we're challenged with, and that we're working on. Next slide, please. So just in terms of, I guess, a summary of what we're really focusing on, we've got a fantastic capability. It's actually quite rich and deep, spanning over 30 plus years of growth. And there's actually a number of firsts that have come out of Australia and out of this part of the world. But the problem we've got is that the confidence in the ecosystem is not where it needs to be. We're not good at selling ourselves, and we're not good at selling our story. So from a clusters perspective, that's a really big piece that we're focused on, is building that confidence. We're also building capability. And that's a key, I guess that's what actually we spent a lot of time doing. And because of that growth that I illustrated and that opportunity that I illustrated with the boom, we're also trying to make sure that we feed the pump to build capacity and scale our companies as quickly as we possibly can. And so that ties into the connections. And from a business perspective, and this is why it was really important from our perspective to enable a business model where the actual ecosystem owns the cluster, owns our direction, and owns our future. So we've kind of structured, instead of a membership based, we have essentially a share process or share scheme, essentially. So if you're a robotics company, you actually own shares in the cluster itself. You have a vote on the direction, and you have ownership in where we go to. And so that's really important. If we go to the next slide, which is, I think, my final slide, I'll just summarize. One of the things that we're really trying to work at is I highlighted that difference in the funding. So here in Australia, there are some funding opportunities, but they're not at the magnitude that we see elsewhere in the world. So we're trying to change that. So part of the business model and part of our future going forward is to stimulate growth, stimulate that scale, but also provide mechanisms by which the companies can. So part of that is a future robotics fund. So it's actually attracting investors directly and allowing that investment to go into the seed rounds of incubating companies or new ideas that are coming forward, but also to help in the scale up. And most of you who know more details around investment, if you get actually a number of players, and usually if we can get a vote of confidence by a couple of key investors, you actually get more investment attraction. So we're hoping that through this mechanism and through some of our key partnerships around the world, we can stimulate some of that growth through this process. And again, it's this early days. We're still learning a lot, and we're trying things out. Now, one thing I wanted to really highlight is that the experience and working with Victor and Christian has been incredibly valuable, and bouncing ideas and looking at other business models has been quite enlightening. So I just want to thank you guys, and hopefully that snapshot was useful to everybody. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, Andrew. And what I really appreciate here is, and I know we talked about this, a lot of clusters are initiated by lone heroes, champions, and they succeed, overcoming all against all odds. But I think what you're doing here is also you're working both at the cluster level, but you're also trying to nudge the Australian government toward developing a more supporting infrastructure or a national cluster program potentially. And that's dual complexity and dual difficulty, but you're taking it on.
I've got some friends and I've got some allies, so that's really been helpful.
Fantastic. And I haven't mentioned this for you, Andrew, but I also have some new work coming your way in terms of how to successfully start and scale new venture funds. So I'll be sharing something with you in the next couple of days that hopefully can support your initiative even more.
Excellent. That's music to my ears. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are going to jump to our next case, which is from Europe. Very different story, very different background, and also a very different evolution of business models over time. So Vladimir, Andro, very happy to have you both with us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good day to everybody. So just the next slide, please. I'm Vladimir Gumiller. I'm cluster manager of the construction cluster of Slovenia. With Andro, my colleague, will try to present the evolvement of our cluster business model. Even at the start, when we started in 2004, there was no clue what this is, but we try to encode this business model in this template, in this canvas. So I think we will present a typical development of clusters in Europe, or maybe also in other countries. Actually, as in many countries, this started with support of the government. In 2004, I think 2002 was the first cluster supported in Slovenia. And nobody more or less knew what is cluster at that time. I was involved in the leadership of R&D activities in institute. And then this was some kind of follow-up of these activities. So no clue what is cluster, but there was money behind, and that was interesting for us in the sector. And we started to do what was suggested by the ministry at that time, developing the cluster, and the key organization in the sector, contractors and other joined this cluster. So we were quite well on track. What is important, we focus on developing the innovation potential of the companies, but what is not here on this canvas, it's that there was at that time support for cluster projects. Actually, the money was not only for cluster organization and its services, but also for projects. So this, I think, was very good compared to many clusters which are now supported more or less as cluster offices, and they have to search for financing the project in some other sources. There were salaries in terms of cost structure, office rental, and that was the case. And the key stakeholder we had external was the ministry. The membership relation was quite formal with cluster members meeting on General Assembly, working in preparation of some projects, and corporates, companies were the main cluster members, and also some institutes and universities, faculties in construction sector. As regard the funding, there was subsidies for cluster development from the ministry and some smaller membership fees. So this is the start and not lasted very long. So maybe the next, also, let's say, traditional business model is the next one. Please go to the next slide. And this is more or less focused on projects. European project was somehow of key source of financing of cluster activities and cluster projects. And we also developed first relation with external ecosystems like European Construction Technology Platform, where we got first international partners for European projects. And we focus on this part. And we try to involve our cluster members into these projects where possible. But the bad thing which happened, we a little bit reduced the work with cluster members, and that was not good. And we have to do something about it. And this comes to the next business model. Next slide. Which is about getting even more connected to other networks, other ecosystems. Here is European Cluster Collaboration Platform, other clusters, Renovate Europe campaign. So this opened a lot of opportunities for other projects and collaborations. And still, development of the innovation potential of companies is the same, but this is now in broader context, in international context. We managed to prepare and coordinate also European projects, and we intensified also the work with our cluster members, even much more than before. We started to use website, LinkedIn, newsletters more actively, and this was the first step towards the improvement and to again some kind of transformation of the cluster as such. So we cannot say that we are emerging because we have a long way behind us, but still we are in some kind of transformation phase of the cluster as such. So we come to the current situation. Next slide. Second. And this is again reaching more and more connection internationally. We managed to involve our cluster in a number of European cluster partnerships and connect to different clusters around the world. And this was very, very important for opening new opportunities for collaboration. We also established a new partnerships internationally, like with universities from other countries beyond Europe, Russia, for example. And we started with our initiative of International Circular Construction Cluster, which is meant to be a cluster of change, supporting transition to circular economy. So this is now this wish to state of the cluster, when we also need to develop new services for the clusters. And as you can see now in this private funding, there is service fee, which is our aim in terms of assuring finances. No public funding still, and moving a little bit away from EU projects, but still this is important part because this only focusing on EU project financing, it's not a good way to go on. We also work hardly with members, communicated intensively. This was also due to COVID, but it's good, very good. We use many means: Zoom meetings, emails, e-newsletter, website, LinkedIn, Twitter, phone calls, recommendations, how to do something, how to collaborate one-to-one, person-to-person communication, more communication and work with the cluster members. And this also led actually to new members, to different kind of members, which can be a gateway to other companies like secondary school, technical schools, and media, and also some organization which are in terms of sector, cross-sectoral, in the domain of digitalization, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and so on. So to build a strong interdisciplinary cluster, able to address different challenges which are ahead of us, mainly in the circular economy related domains, and digitalization. So if we stress a little bit more some other things, next slide. So this key ecosystem and cluster which were like here now are presented here, and as you see at the beginning, we focus on, or was actually established by the ministry, then moved to the network of organization in the cluster in the construction field, European Construction Technology Platform and the partners of there, then to cluster community, Renovate Europe, later on strongly involved in cluster partnerships, and this is where we are now. And we would like to have more partners internationally around the globe, not only in Europe. And this relates to our initiative of International Circular Construction Cluster, which will be an ecosystem where we can collaborate not only on project level, but sustainably over the time. Next slide. So this is again overview. What were the cluster activities? More or less services for members in regard the development of innovation potential, supporting the first projects, national project, which was supported at that time with the subsidy of the ministry. But later on, we moved to European projects, writing project proposal, and also communication with members, but not so much as well it should be done. And now we have activities in the field of developing new services internationally, and we are trying to attract new members across sectoral field. And we are learning, developing new skills, new knowledge on business models. Even this was started by my colleague Andro, who learned about that some years ago. And if he can say some words, maybe I forgot a couple of things, he can add maybe something. Next slide. And we saw that this communication with members is highly important, very important. And we must confess that we were not doing enough in this regard in the past. And we moved from formal communication to now very informal, very often communication with our members using different means, and also personal communication, because this is really very important. You must know that we are not a big cluster, so we can work with them individually, not in the case of previous one where there are 100 and more members. So we can do it in this way, and we are doing that. And this is one of the recommendations, if possible, try to communicate intensely with the cluster members. Next slide. And as I said already, communication is very important, regularly, formally, informally, but also listen good to their needs, expectations, and try to help them to solve their problems. Second thing, which is very important, build on your competencies and develop a new ones. This is very important. We are learning all the time, and as said at the beginning, business model domain was not known till a couple of years back. So now we are working on that, and I think this is very, very important for us. And then you have to develop your own business model within the cluster, depending on many things. And I think one of the major like framework condition is the financing model behind. If there is no financing support from the government or region, then you have to do it different way, and you have adapt the the cluster business model if this framework condition change. If you are late, probably the cluster will end and or will have major issues to continue its work. So I think this concludes our presentation. Maybe Andro, do you have anything to add?
No, maybe later in the question and answer section. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Christian, back to you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. I mean, I think both Victor and I was very excited when we saw your first draft come in, because you're the first cluster that we have seen that have very distinct on a timeline, the 2004, 2010, 2014, and then as you're progressing. So we could very clearly see, and I loved how you laid this out, very clearly see the evolution over time. So well done. Now I'm going to take a couple of kind of key points here before we open for discussions. Now, the high level ambition that we have here is really exploring cluster business models in practice. And by exploring, we mean two things. Number one, we are learning from and with a large number of clusters from all around the world. So in the report, we have published the first batch. I think we have about six case studies, but we also have a second batch coming, which are giving us very different perspectives. And it's really fascinating to see how different business models are emerging. So that's one, it's exploring. The second is, of course, the tools and the frameworks. Because what we originally started with was very few people actually know what we mean when we say, or someone says, cluster business models. So we broke it down and said, first we got to figure out your income side or your revenue side. And here we have three pieces: public-private project. Then we have to look at your cost side. And then over time, we also need to look at the value proposition, the partnerships, the ecosystems, the channels, and all the different pieces that make up a business model. And I think it's really interesting to see how these tools are now coming into action. Now, some of the key insights that we have. So key insight number one, this is a poorly understood concept and construct. There are people that are really gaining a lot of experience and expertise, but largely working with government agencies, working with cluster programs, working with economic development agencies, working with cluster boards. It's a very, very poorly understood concept. There's a big misunderstanding that government should fund clusters, period. And there are examples where government have no stake in even supporting clusters. So I think it's important to bring this together and say it's really a combination between public, private, but it can be constructed in very creative ways. Key insight number two is there has been a lot of interest and also a lot of awareness over the last couple of months as we've been working on this. So I would actually suggest that we're both in the US, Canada, some of the work that we've done in Europe, also towards the Middle East, there's a growing awareness and interest globally. But maybe the most important thing is, because we've seen some people in some of the mentioned countries that have basically picked up some of the materials and said, I'm going to go run a workshop. And that's good. That's a start. But for the majority of participants, this is such a new topic that it's going to take months, most likely years, before it really sticks. So for those of you that are joining this webinar, I really encourage you to download the material, get the report, initiate conversations with your board, but don't think that this is going to be settled in a single workshop. Like Victor said initially, it's an iterative process that you have to repeat again and again. And for every time you repeat it, people will have a different understanding, will bring a different perspective, and hopefully also bring different elements into the conversation. So poorly understood, growing awareness, and don't expect this to be very quick and easy. Now, what we see in practice, also concluding out some of the work in the report, is that for most cluster managers, the starting point is just simply to understand. Then as you evolve, you have to map, optimize, evolve, and compete. So for many cluster managers, I'm probably going to say probably going to say about 70%. The starting point has to be a basic understanding. So the cluster manager basically needs to sit down and read about this, think about it, and start like we saw here from our friends with the in Slovenia. We have to basically map out as is the situation. That takes you into step number 2, where we start mapping, we start visualizing, we start using, for example, the cluster business model canvas or the value impact tool. We have to optimize, tweak, change. What are things that we can slightly tweak? Are there EU funding projects? Could we increase a more tiered based membership approach? Could we have some of the large Asian-based venture funds that could come in and actually be the cornerstone investments in a dedicated cluster-specific venture fund? I mean, once you start going into private equity financing, you're absolutely evolving and experimenting. And then we're starting to see some clusters that we've been working with or spoken with that have I'm going to call it a very hungry desire to actually be competing on business models, not just surviving. Big difference. Because if you're surviving, you're just scraping by with very limited resources. But the best ones are able to actually really, get this at the intellectual level and then implement it into the place where they're actually able to compete internationally. And Andrew, I know we've spoken about this, but I think what you are doing in terms of building up venture funds, initiating government collaboration, you're absolutely sprinting through these 5 levels here. So we'll see where you are in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, the last slide, how do we get started? Well, it's actually pretty simple. In the report, we put together a short recommendation for how do we get started. You want to start by sketching out the cluster value triangle that Victor talked about. You want to map out what is the current business model we have. You want to make sure that you engage your board and your stakeholders, because this is not a one-man or a one-woman show. You probably need to evolve and iterate, so small changes to your current business models, and then collaborate with other clusters or other cluster initiatives to learn more of what others are doing. And I think finally, the big message here is you're not supposed to be the designer. Your job is not to design the ultimate cluster business model. Your job is to initiate the conversations, engage key stakeholders, go out and talk with various funding partners that can be a part of this, but don't try to do everything yourself. So that's where we are right now. I'll be very happy to take some more questions. I can see a few questions in the chat already. So we're very happy, and you can just ask questions directly to anyone and I'll direct it, or you can ask points directly to Victor, to Andrew, or Vladimir. So any questions? Now, maybe I'm going to start, Victor. I want to have a quick question from you. If you look in your personal experience, how many clusters actually have a good understanding of cluster business models in your view?
Yeah, not many, I would say. And it has to do with the fact that we still can learn so much more from other cluster experiences. Just before the webinar, I was talking to somebody in Finland, a healthcare cluster working on a specific delivery of social care, welfare care, and hospital care in a regional setting. I quickly threw out all my interview questions because I was mostly struck by the fact that how they pushed the agenda of collaboration and the necessity of working as a one entity, one type organization. So they pulled in all their stakeholders and said, this is the challenge that we're facing, and this we think needs to be the solution. So I was just looking at how I was just looking for their success factors. I was just probing them. Okay, but how did this happen? I mean, we have the same issues in the Netherlands with combining these areas. and we haven't been able to get to a national e-health record as one example. So I think that's really key in the whole. I was just jotting down some of the C's that came from Andrew and Vladimir. Andrew was talking about capability and capacity building. Vladimir was talking about the collaboration and the communication. And I was writing it down and said, okay, these 4 C's lead to community. So community equals cluster maybe, but that is why we need to keep talking and need the conversation going, because these different perspectives give you different insights. And that's I think the power of the whole community coming together in places like this webinar, sharing this information and knowledge.
Victor, we're starting to get some good questions coming in. Andrew, I'm going to direct the first question to you because I want to have your view on this. So the first question is from Rafa, and he asks, what is a cluster and what's the difference between a industry association and a cluster? And Andrew, I just want to have your view on that.
Yes, well, I think they're related, but I think it's the depth at which the engagement happens and the what I like to call the transactions that happen within the ecosystem. So for me, an association has a really important role around advocacy and a lot of that type of bringing together and sort of that branding. But a cluster actually goes further and actually stimulates transactions between the participants that actually ends up in further value creation, whether it's referrals, whether it's potentially collaborative projects, a whole range of different things. So it really is the depth of that activity is my view.
Thank you very much. Now we have a second question. I'm gonna merge 2 questions. We have one from Jonathan joining us from Malaysia and one from Daniel joining us from Switzerland. And it's really towards the service level, how clusters are maybe different from consulting services. Now I'll have a first jab, and then Victor, I'll hand it over to you in terms of sort of the revenue and membership fee. So the big idea is that clusters need to be industry-led. Now they can be government supported, but they need to be an industry-led. And once they are, they should be able to address industry-level challenges. And that means that good clusters work to solve challenges that individual companies typically are not able to. So a lot of clusters have a pretty high willingness to pay a membership fee, because the organizations, the participating members, recognizes that the cluster can help them solve things that a consulting firm would never be able to do, that a single company initiative would never be able to do. Typical examples are industry-wide training programs, MBA programs, research programs, industry-wide data sharing initiatives, international go-to-market export programs, and so on and so forth. But Victor, if you're going to have a jab, sort of the financing model and how it's different from just a standard consulting service.
The financing for us different in the cluster. We've changed two and a half years ago from a flat model fee for all participants to a company size-based model. It's very common. And we were quite anxious to see if the larger corporations that were part of it would swallow this 10 times over fee from last year. Amazing thing that happened was that the large corporations just came to us and said, we are very willing to pay this much higher fee based on the size of our company, but we are going to sit down and talk value. What is the cluster actually giving us to justify this higher partnership fee? So we all of a sudden had much more engagement from corporations saying, okay, value by paying the partnership fee was also kind of value perceived from the cluster network itself. We can bring more, but we can also take more, and that really strengthened the whole partnership deal much more than a regular project maybe could have done.
We have another question here from, let's see, from, I missed where we saw it, but maybe I could ask you, Vladimir and Andro, you've been doing this for a very long time. How do you build trust? And how do you build trust amongst the members within the cluster?
Okay, I will try to answer to this question. The first, we almost lost trust because we didn't communicate. And it's very, I saw it's very important to have a trust. This is the key resource for the cluster, because without the trust, you are maybe association. That's the answer for one on the questions, because someone joined you because of some particular interest, you know. But the cluster is much wider than association. It's like an ecosystem. It's wider than a project. And if you want to operate this ecosystem, you simply need trust. That means that you must do what you promised, that you must try to understand your cluster members. So what they are doing, what they are wanted to achieve, what are their problems, and trying to help them to solve these problems. And I don't know how to explain how to build trust, but you must just take this in mind and build trust every day with everyday activities.
Maybe I can add a little to building that trust. If the like you said, the partner or the partners in the cluster have their challenges and their problems, and if you as a cluster manager can help add value to the solution of that issue that they have, then they will see that the actual value in the cluster membership is there. So the trust comes with being able to help them out. And that can also mean that you search for them interesting partners to collaborate with them. If they have a development issue or they're looking for a specific type of manufacturing component, if you're able to deliver that solution to them, that will every time help them build trust in the process.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have 2 closing questions, and here we have a third closing question. We're going to try to close them out really quickly because we are at the hour. So the first question is from Daniel in terms of the IP rights. Like, how do we deal with IP rights within clusters? And I'll give you a quick answer. It's usually not a big problem once a cluster has been in place and been working for a while, because rules, behaviors, standards have been created. So it's typically not a big issue. One question here from Philip. And Victor, I'm going to give it back to you as the closing question here. What is the difference between the quintuple helix and the pentagon or the quintuple helix? You know, triple helix, 4 helix, 5 helix. Why does this matter? What's the difference?
I'll try to give a short answer. For me, the change is in the traditional triple helix. That's been a model, it's been around for 30 years. And the paradigm shift as we see it and we're describing it is by adding more entrepreneurship areas to it and be able to bring in VC capital. And the obvious advantages of those are that the entrepreneurship not only helps you run accelerators, helps you in the whole startup scale-up arena, but you need then, again, if you're moving into the accelerator arena, you need some capital influx of financing those accelerators. And that will help, again, the academia to bring in the students. If the students are there and they can build their startups in the theme that you're trying to address in the pentagram, it becomes a flying wheel. It becomes a magnet that Andrew also talked about. You will have influx of capabilities, of talent, of money coming in, and that will eventually bring a much more speed into the development of your region or your cluster initiative.
And on that note, my friends, we are 2 minutes over time. Andrew, you're joining us from down under. Andro, Vladimir, Victor from different locations in Europe. You guys watching this, you're joining us from all over the world, from early morning in Costa Rica and through very, very different locations. I hope that this has been insightful. I hope that you've been able to learn from our good friends here. I hope that we can continue conversations around how to shape better understanding, both at the government level, economic development agency level, cluster program level, cluster board level, and then the operating level of a cluster. I think that we're just starting, and you'll probably see much more work happen in this space in coming months and years. Victor, thank you as always. Vladimir, Andro, Andrew, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Stay well,
Thanks, guys.
Stay in touch. All the presentations will be sent out shortly. Thank you very much.